All right. What did Hitler think of Slavs? Okay. Did Hitler just want to kill all the Slavs as Untermenschen, or was he the liberator, the great liberator who would never hurt a hair on a Slav's head and just wanted to liberate them from Bolshevism and so forth? And let's just get into it. This is a topic. I thought this might be fun because more and more there's a kind of dissident rightist, or even a centrist, even Joe Rogan types are kind of getting in on the recast of Hitler as like a wholesome Chungus kind of victim character, and he's only trying to do what's right and trying to avoid war, but the colonial powers are picking on him, and he's a victim of colonialism, and he stands for people of color and so on and so forth, and especially he loves Jews and would never even dream of hurting one. And but I don't know, the maybe the refreshing thing about really getting into facts is that real quickly you don't have to care that much about these kind of narrative biases and who the good guy is, because Hitler himself didn't really care that much about. He's not trying to even really argue that he's the good guy for everybody. But I don't know. Well, let's just get into it, and we'll start with Mein Kampf and Hitler's book. Everyone's familiar with this. Some people are going to say there's no value in reading this, or there's misconceptions about this. Some people might say this is just a bunch of pap that he wrote for bourgeois people. There's nothing really based in here. It's just him bitching about his dad, and it's just about him. He wants to be an artist, and he's a mama's boy, but his dad is beating his ass all the time, or whatever. And actually the book, when you read it, it's pretty consistent, and it has it gets pretty wild, and it gets pretty fun at times, especially I think the second half more than the first. But we'll just get into a quote. Here we go. Hitler's talking about Russia. We're going to talk especially about, there's only so much we can cover with this because there's a lot on the topic. We'll especially be talking about like Russia, Ukraine, Soviet Union type. And I've only got so much time to talk about Polish people or something like that, or Slovaks versus Slovenes and things. And I know that's where a lot of the Hitler was the best friend of Slavic people stuff is going to come from. Like, look what he did for the Slovaks or something. But we only have so much time. But I'll just get into this. He's talking about Russia. He says the German people was not yet ripe for being forced into the bloody Bolshevistic morass, as had happened in Russia. This is due in large part to the greater racial unity that still existed between the German intelligentsia and the German manual worker. Further, in the great permeation, or even the broadest strata of the people with educated elements, such as prevailed only in the other countries of Western Europe, but was totally lacking in Russia. There, the intelligentsia itself was in large part not of Russian nationality, or at least was of non-Slavic racial character. The thin and intellectual upper stratum of the Russia of that time could at any time be removed due to the total lack of connecting intermediary ingredients with the mass of the great people, and the intellectual and moral level of these last was horribly low. Once it was possible in Russia to incite the uneducated hordes of the great masses unable to read or write against the thin intellectual upper crust that stood in no relation or connection to them, the fate of the country was decided. The revolution had succeeded. The Russian illiterate had thus become defenseless slave of his Jewish dictators, who for their part, it must be admitted, were clever enough to let this dictatorship ride on the phrase of people's dictatorship. In Germany, there was a... So, this is the what makes us different. In Germany, you have a German intelligentsia. In Russia, you have a non-Slavic intelligentsia, the upper crust. This is a thin upper crust that had ruled Russia for forever, and they're ruling over the mass, the hordes of the Slavic character. This is what he says, and then so what you've had in Russia is they've gotten rid of that. What was called a class war, Hitler very much sees as a race war, where this nobility, which had produced all the artistic achievements of Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution, is now wiped out, and he's saying Jews are replacing them as the intelligentsia, because these people can't rule themselves, but somebody else is going to step in and rule. That's his view. I mean, is that not what he said right there? And we'll go on. This is Mein Kampf, Hitler's book. Hitler's view, you'll see. We'll just get into it. My struggle. Okay. If we speak of soil in Europe today, we can primarily have in mind only Russia and her vassal border states. Here, fate itself seems... So, he's talking about Lebensraum. He's talking about a German colonial policy. Where should they look to? He says, here, fate itself seems desirous of giving us a sign. By handing Russia to Bolshevism, it robbed the Russian nation of that intelligentsia which previously brought about and guaranteed its existence as a state. For the organization of a Russian state formation was not the result of the political abilities of the Slavs in Russia, but only a wonderful example of the state-forming efficacy of the German element in an inferior race. Numerous mighty empires on earth have been created in this way. So there's the German element, which creates the state for the inferior Slavic race. This is what he says. Lower nations, led by Germanic organizers and overlords, have more than once grown to be mighty state formations and have endured as long as the racial nucleus of the creative state race maintained itself. For centuries, Russia drew nourishment from this Germanic nucleus of its upper leading strata. Today, it can be regarded as almost totally exterminated and extinguished. It has been replaced by the Jew. Impossible as it is for the Russian by himself to shake off the yoke of the Jew by his own resources, It is equally impossible for the Jew to maintain the mighty empire forever. He himself is no element of organization, but a ferment of decomposition. The Persian Empire in the East is ripe for collapse, and the end of Jewish rule in Russia will also be the end of Russia as a state. We have been chosen by fate as witnesses of a catastrophe which will be the mightiest confirmation of the soundness of the folkish theory. Okay. So, and he's saying that this is a good thing, basically, that they'd like to take over Russia, but he's saying the Jewish people have done a lot of the work for them, and you'll see it's kind of consistent where Hitler will point to different nations and that you'd want to take out their intelligentsia. Like this was done to in World War II, to get ahead of ourselves. What they did to Poland, say where Poland was a Slavic nation that had the Polish nation had a Polish intelligentsia, so that's who the Germans targeted. But he's looking at Russia at this time, and he's saying it's kind of good that Bolshevism's done this work for us. Basically, it's wiped out this intelligentsia, but he's also saying that in Russia, it's different than other nations because the intelligentsia is different than the rest of the Russians, so-called, the Slavic Russians, so-called. Okay. So he goes on, he talks about maybe how their policy has to be different than, say, Bismarck's. And he's talking about how he doesn't see Russia as being that great of an ally. And here's actually some interesting stuff. So, like, some of the stuff not that people will go on about now, it seems very relevant. Where Hitler's talking about a league of oppressed nations. He says, this is in line of the League of Oppressed Nations propagated by many. Chiefly involved were representatives of various Balkan states and some from Egypt and India, who as individuals always impressed me as pompous big mouths with but he's talking about how there's all these oppressed nations and people, Germans at the time. Germany is in a very bad spot when he's writing this book. But he's saying that people are saying they should throw in with like a league of oppressed nations. That's what he calls it. Okay. And we're getting a bit off topic, but it kind of presents itself. So it reminds of like BRICS and stuff like that, where certain Americans are saying we should throw in this is for the attempt to disarm the almighty victors through a league of oppressed nations is not only ridiculous but also catastrophic as well. It is catastrophic because it distracts our people again and again from its practical possibilities, making them devote themselves to yada yada yada. But yeah, he's saying that the Russia of today is different than Bismarck's, and that also the position wouldn't help, and so on and whoop-de-woo. But okay, so he's talking about the League of Oppressed Nations. It just happens to be impossible to overwhelm with the coalition of cripples a powerful state that is determined to stake, if necessary, its last drop of blood for its existence. As a folkish man who appraised the value of men on a racial basis, I am prevented by mere knowledge of the racial inferiority of these so-called oppressed nations from linking the destiny of my own people with theirs. And today we must take exactly the same position toward Russia. Present-day Russia, divested of her Germanic upper stratum, is quite aside from the private intentions of her new masters no ally for the German nation's fight for freedom. Considered from the purely military angle, the relations would be simply catastrophic in case of war between Germany and Russia and Western Europe, and probably against all the rest of the world. The struggle would take place not on Russian, but on German soil, and Germany would not be able to obtain the least effective support from Russia. So, and this is why we there's no point in allying with Russia like, say, Bismarck or something, because it would only, we'd have an ally in Russia where it's not backing us up, and the war is going to be fought on German soil. Okay, but it is very much, you kind of think of like a BRICS type thing with a league of oppressed nations, and he's saying that he doesn't see it that way. He rejects this view that they should get involved in something like that. He said that's not going to beat the British Empire with this sort of thing. Okay, but he continues on. All right, why not to go in with Russia? The present rulers of Russia have no idea of honorably entering into an alliance, let alone observing one. Never forget that the rulers of present-day Russia are common blood-stained criminals, that they are the scum of humanity, which, favored by circumstances, overran a great state in a tragic hour, slaughtered and wiped out thousands of her leading intelligentsia in wild bloodlust, and now for almost 10 years have been carrying on the most cruel and tyrannical regime of all time. Furthermore, do not forget that these rulers belong to a race which combines in a rare mixture bestial cruelty and an inconceivable gift for lying, and which today more than ever is conscious of a mission to impose its bloody oppression on the whole world. Okay. So, do not forget that the international Jew who completely dominates Russia today regards Germany not as an ally but as a state destined to the same fate. So this is how he views Russia. He says Russia once had a German rulers, a German intelligentsia, and upper culture creating, culture bearing stratum. Now they've been eliminated by the new rulers and so on. So this is why Russia was basically fragile, but this is also good for Germany. This might... Okay, what else we got? Mein Kampf. We're reading Hitler's book. The danger to which Russia succumbed is always present for Germany. Okay. What else? The fight against the Jewish world Bolshevization requires a clear attitude towards Soviet Russia. You cannot drive out the devil with Beelzebub. Today, even folkish circles rave about an alliance with Russia, they should just look around them in Germany and see whose support they find in their efforts. Or have the folkish men lately begun to view an activity as beneficial to the German people, which is recommended and promoted by the international Marxist press? Since when do folkish men fight with armor held out to them by a Jewish squire? Okay. Hitler says... All right, so he's talking about... Some of this is he's talking about the rulers of the Soviet Union, who he views at this time as the rulers of the Soviet Union. And he's saying that Germany is in the crosshairs, but he doesn't want to view Germany as a oppressed nation. He never really views he never really wants to view himself as a victim or take on a victim. Sometimes maybe he does, but typically he's pretty consistent about rejecting that kind of framework that people kind of present Hitler with now, like Hitler the victim who didn't do nothing. Okay. Hitler says, "I have not forgotten the insolent threat which the pan-Slavic Russia of that time dared to address to Germany. I have not forgotten the constant practice mobilizations whose sole purpose..." Okay, he's talking about the pre-war period now. Where he says, "I openly confess that even in the pre-war period, I would have thought it sounder if Germany, renouncing her senseless colonial policy..." Okay, "I have not forgotten the insolent threat which the pan-Slavic Russia of that time dared to address Germany. I have not forgotten the constant practice mobilizations whose sole purpose was an affront to Germany. I cannot forget the mood of public opinion in Russia, which outdid itself in hateful outbursts against our people and our Reich. I cannot forget the big Russian newspapers, which were always more enthusiastic about France than about us. But in spite of all that, before the war..." Okay. So he's saying that there could have been... It says there could have been an alliance with Russia before the war. But he's not going to forget. He's talking about... In fact, he's talking about the Tsarist Russia with that. Okay. Well, about... Maybe we'll get out of Mein Kampf, but... Maybe one part we should hit up real quick is interesting, somewhat famous. But Hitler talks about he's talking about when he was a boy. He's a schoolboy. He says, "The Russo-Japanese War found me considerably more mature, but also more attentive. More for national reasons, I had already taken sides, and in our little discussions at once sided with the Japanese. In the defeat of the Russians, I saw the defeat of Austrian Slavdom." So we get into that. I don't want to get that far into all the Slavdom of all the Austrian Slavdom. He says, right across from that, "The greatest friend of the Slavs had fallen beneath the bullets of Slavic fanatics." He's talking about the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He says he was a great friend of the Slavs, but he was shot by the Slavic fanatics. But Hitler says he took the side of the Japanese against the Russians. So he was no Russophile by any means even then, and in fact he was a weeb who loved anime. So what else do we got? We'll get into, you know what? We'll get into Albert Speer with Inside the Third Reich. And say what you will about this book or Speer himself, he's clearly a huge liar to some degree. It's one of the most self-serving books you'll ever read. It's kind of, it's wild how the whole book he pretty much talks about how he's like the most talented person in the Third Reich and is doing all the stuff for Nazi Germany, and all the Allies hate him the most, and Hitler wanted to him to take over after him, and so on. But then also he's not a Nazi. Even he joined the party, but only, you know, just for whatever. And he's not racist, and he thinks a little bit of race mixing is fine and good. And he also, you know, thought about killing Hitler himself and all this stuff. It gets pretty preposterous, but at the same time, a lot of the stuff in the book is probably true. It's not a complete departure of reality. It's just he's just self-serving in his after getting out of prison. and all that, but he could say whatever. It's pretty nauseating to read, and you kind of figure a lot of it, but there's a lot of interesting stuff in the book as well. Okay, but he talks a lot about how Hitler conducted himself and how he'd go on these monologues, and he lays out kind of the scenery for like the table talk type stuff, and how he's always talking about this sort of things. He gives good context for table talk type stuff. He says, if in the course of such a monologue Hitler had pronounced a more negative judgment upon the church, Bormann would undoubtedly have taken from his jacket pocket one of the white cards he always carried with him, for he noted down all Hitler's remarks that seemed to him important, and there was hardly anything he wrote down more eagerly than deprecating comments on the church. At the time, I assumed that he was gathering material for a biography of Hitler. So this gives kind of an explanation for why Hitler's always like ripping on the Catholic Church in the table talk or going on about Christianity, because this is what Bormann was the most into. And so he goes into some of the monologues on this type stuff, but then he's talking about Obert Salzburg, and then Hitler usually concluded the historical speculation. So he would talk about if Charles Martel had been defeated, if Germans had converted to Islam or whatever. Okay, but then getting past this, Speer says, it is remarkable that even before the war, he sometimes went on. This is him quoting Hitler. Hitler says, today, the Siberians, the White Russians, and the people of the steppes live extremely healthy lives. For that reason, they are better equipped for development and in the long run, biologically superior to the Germans. Okay, and then Speer says, this was an idea he was destined to repeat in far more drastic tones during the last months of the war. So he says this in the last months of the war, but also he said it's remarkable that he would say this before the war as well. This sort of thing where he's speculating and pontificating that there are certain types of White Russians and stuff, and he wasn't totally unfamiliar in a lot of the early Nazis actually were like Baltic Germans and people from chased out of the Soviet Union, and a lot of White Russians and things actually did have a lot of influence on the Germans at the time, especially German Nazis. But he doesn't know exactly what he's dealing with. I mean, he gives a few, like the people of the steppes, Siberians, White Russians, but he's saying that these seem like a healthier people in some ways. So this is almost a more of a Spenglerian type idea, and not exclusive to Spengler or something. A lot of Germans at the time thought stuff like this or speculated stuff like this. But he would say that these could be, he's as biologically superior in the long run than Germans, or better equipped for development. So this could be, I don't know, say what you will. This is, it's an interesting quote right there, and maybe that'll put things in perspective or give things some nuance as we move along. So what else do we have for Albert Speer? what else he say? This is kind of... Where am I at? Well, right here he says, this is off topic a little bit, but he did not exactly repudiate the alliance of Japan from the racist point of view, a dubious affair, but he took a tone of reserve toward it as far as the more distant future was concerned. Whenever he touched on this theme, he implied that he was somewhat sorry about having made an alliance with the so-called yellow race, but then he would remind himself that England too had mobilized Japan against the Central Powers in the World War. Hitler considered Japan an ally that ranked as a world power, whereas he was not convinced that Italy was in the same class. So that's interesting. He views the Japanese is a different, is the yellow race, but they're above, he views them as a world power above Italy. And it's just it's something of Hitler's view. He doesn't look at things as like an objective morality, and his approach isn't to look across the whole world and just find who he likes. He views it from, he's thinking German centric from his perspective as a German. How should things go, and not who are the good guys. He's not saying, he would never figure that his own side could be the bad guys, because it's his own side. That's just, there is no good guy or bad guy to it. That's just how it is. But he views maybe the Japanese as they're maybe a superior people, but they're different. But it's still strange that he would get along with him. What else? This is kind of different too, but we'll just go over this. He says, Hitler would often theorize to the effect that it was a mistake to export ideas such as National Socialism. So, to do so would only lead to a strengthening of nationalism in other countries, he said, and thus to a weakening of his own position. So he doesn't necessarily want other countries to pick up National Socialism, because his doctrine would only help them out, and it's not really something that he's trying to do. He's trying to conquer other countries, not have other countries realize their own greatness or be extreme competitors or something. He was glad to see that the Nazi parties of other countries produced no leader of his own caliber. He considered the Dutch Nazi leader Mussert and Sir Oswald Mosley, chief of the British Nazi Party, mere copyists who had no original or new ideas. They only imitated us and our methods slavishly, he commented, and would never amount to anything. In every country, so he takes a low view of other Nazi leaders like Mosley and things like that. They're only copying them. They're not something in themselves. And he looks down on them. And it says, in every country, you had to start from different premises and change your methods accordingly, he argued. He had a better opinion of de Grelle, but did not expect much of him either. This is what Albert Speer says. So de Grelle is a little bit better, but not that much better. Okay, that's kind of a departure, but nevertheless, that can maybe give some color on where he's coming from with this. All right, where are we going with this? I don't know. We'll just keep on going. What else do we have? Oh, we'll just wrap it up with Albert Speer. We'll go from Albert Salzburg to the bunker, the Führer bunker. So this is Hitler's told Albert Speer they're getting like you said, he would pick up more on the theme of maybe a Slavic superiority later in the war, because he had to explain why, the German army wasn't as successful as he expected, and why they're getting overrun by his view. Again, is not there's not necessarily good guys or bad guys, but there's the strong are meant to dominate. The superior race is meant to conquer. He would point at the Spartans a lot as a racial state, because they conquered the Helots. They enslaved the Helots to do all the work for them while they would go fight. And he thought this is a good thing, and other things that they did as well. So he starts revisiting these ideas about maybe white Russians and people of the steppes being superior. Later on, Speer's visiting Hitler because he has not done all the scorched earth things in Germany that he says. And Hitler says, he made a brief pause, then in an icy tone continued, "If the war is lost, the people will be lost also. It is not necessary to worry about what the German people will need for elemental survival. On the contrary, it is best for us to destroy even these things. For the nation has proved to be weaker, and the future belongs solely to the stronger Eastern nation. In any case, only those who are inferior will remain after the struggle. For the good have already been killed." So, who's he talking about? I've seen people interpret this as like the good have been killed, like the Germans have been killed, and the weaker, the inferior who remain are the Slavs. But it seems more like the best of the Germans have already been killed. So who cares? Because only the inferior Germans are still around. The best are killed. So who cares? The stronger nation is going to take over, which is from the east, he says. Okay, this is totally consistent with other things he says. Like a lot of what he'd said before about World War I, his complaints were that all the worst people survived the war, and that the best people were killed. And he even would say comments like that, like they should have on who should have been gassed instead of who, And a lot of what National Socialism was about was reordering things in these ways to make so a real nobility would kind of shine out from maybe from the peasantry, and the worst people would be weeded out. But this hasn't worked out, is what he's saying. And but yeah, that's just how he viewed things. Even in the end, he's not really seeing him as a victim. He's not really complaining that the good guy lost. It kind of disturbs other people around him, but he's able to just shrug and say, well, I guess the enemy's proven to be a superior race, is what he says. And so he's being overrun by, the bunkers are being overrun by all these Soviet soldiers. And say what you will. I mean, I think just to pontificate, I would say that, a lot of why this is relevant now and why more people, what did Hitler think of Slavs, is all of the stuff. The Nazi stuff keeps on, is still a big thing. And also we're dealing with now Russians, Ukrainians, and things. Of course, 40% of the frontline troops that the Soviets had in Berlin were Ukrainian. I would argue these might have been the real hitters of the Soviets. These Ukrainian troops probably did. you figure that who are these guys who ended up overrunning? You know, maybe the Germans did make some mistakes. Of course, Hitler identified some of these things early on, but anyway, we're just going over exactly what he said in different ways, and this isn't totally exhaustive, but all right, we'll get into the table talk. We've talked about this before, but this is going to be a good place where we get a lot of stuff. We're going to get a lot of bang for the buck. Okay, so Hitler says, when one contemplates the primitive world, one is convinced that nothing will drag it out of its indolence unless one compels the people to work. The Slavs are a mass of born slaves who feel the need of a master. This is in September 1941. He's talking. The Slavs are a mass of born slaves who feel the need of a master. As far as we are concerned, we may think that the Bolsheviks did us a great service. They began by distributing the land to the peasants, and we know what a frightful famine resulted. So they were obliged, of course, to reestablish a sort of feudal regime to the benefit of the state. But there was this difference that whereas the old-style landlord knew something about farming, the political commissar, on the other hand, was entirely ignorant of such matters. So the Russians were just beginning to give their commissars appropriate instruction. Okay, so again, he's saying that as horrible as the Bolsheviks were in Russia, this could be a good thing for us because we're taking over. If the English were to be driven out of India, India would perish. Our role in Russia will be analogous to that of England in India. Even in Hungary, National Socialism could not be exported. In the mass, the Hungarian is as lazy as the Russian. He is by nature a man of the steppe. From this point of view, Horthy is right in thinking that if he abandoned the system of great estates, production would rapidly decline. It's the same as in Spain. If the great domains disappeared there, famine would prevail. The German peasant is moved by a liking for progress. He thinks of his children. The Ukrainian peasant has no notion of duty. There is peasantry comparable to ours in Holland and also in Italy, where every inch of ground is zealously exploited. Also to a certain extent in France. The Russian space is our India. Like the English, we shall rule this empire with a handful of men. It would be a mistake to claim to educate the native. All that we could give him would be half knowledge. Just what's needed to conduct a revolution. It's an interesting quote. The half knowledge is just what's needed to conduct a revolution. It's not a mere chance that the inventor of anarchism was a Russian. Unless other peoples, beginning with the Vikings, had imported some rudiments of organization into Russian humanity, the Russians would still be living like rabbits. One cannot change rabbits into bees or ants. These insects have the faculty of living in a state of society, but rabbits haven't. If left to himself, the Slav would never have emerged from the narrowest of family communities. The Germanic race created the notion of the state. It incarnated this notion in reality by compelling the individual to be part of a whole. It's our duty continually to arouse the forces that slumber in our people's blood. The Slav peoples are not destined to live a cleanly life. They know it, and we would be wrong to persuade them of the contrary. It was we who in 1918 created the Baltic countries and the Ukraine. But nowadays we have no interest in maintaining Baltic states any more than in creating an independent Ukraine. We must likewise prevent them from returning to Christianity. That would be a grave fault, for it would be giving them a form of organization. I am not a partisan either of a university at Kiev. It's better not to teach them to read. They won't love us for tormenting them with schools. Even to give them a locomotive to drive would be a mistake. And what stupidity it would be on our part to a distribution of land. In spite of that, we'll see to it that the natives live better than they've lived hitherto. We'll find amongst them the human material that's indispensable for tilling the soil. We'll supply grain to all of in Europe who need it. The Crimea will give us its citrus fruits, cotton, and rubber. 100,000 acres of plantation would be enough to ensure our independence. The Pripyat marshes will keep us supplied with reeds. We'll supply the Ukrainians with scarves, glass beads, and everything that colonial peoples like. The Germans, this is essential, will have to constitute amongst themselves a closed society, like a fortress. The least of our stable lads must be superior to any native. For German youth, this will be a magnificent field of experiment. We'll attract to the Ukraine Danes, Dutch, Norwegians, Swedes. The army will find areas of maneuvers there, and our aviation will have the space it needs. So on. Okay. All right. But yeah, that gives a good idea of his attitude towards the people of the Soviet Union. So by any means, it's not, you wouldn't say this is the best friend of the Slavs or something, but it's also not quite kill them all. He's saying that we're going to, these are going to be colonial peoples. These are be like the people of India. We're going to rule over them. We're going to give them some, beads and stuff, and they're just gonna like be our slaves pretty much. So it is different than how we might see Jews or the Untermenschen or the like gypsies who Germans would just kill on sight and all that. So it's a little bit different, their view. But it's definitely not a positive. It's not a particularly positive view. This isn't that friendly of a view. But let's just be real. This is what he says. Maybe Bormann got it wrong, but probably not too wrong. And you see how consistent it is with what other people. Maybe a little bit different than what Speer says, but it's very much in line with what he says in Mein Kampf. All right, but let's move on. What else is there? Okay. What do we got? It's absurd to try and suppose that the frontier between the two separate worlds of Europe and Asia is marked by a chain of not very high mountains, and the long chain of the Urals is no more than that. One might just as well decree that the frontier is marked by one of the great Russian rivers. No, geographically, Asia penetrates into Europe without any sharp break. The real frontier is the one that separates the Germanic world from the Slav world. It's our duty to place it where we want it to be. If anyone asks us where we obtain the right to extend the Germanic space to the east, we reply that for a nation, her awareness of what she represents carries this right with it. It's success that justifies everything. The reply to such a question can only be of an empirical nature. It's inconceivable that a higher people should painfully exist on a soil too narrow for it, while amorphous masses, which contribute nothing to civilization, occupy infinite tracts of a soil that is one of the richest in the world. We painfully rest a few meters from the sea, we torment ourselves cultivating marshes, and in the Ukraine, an inexhaustibly fertile soil, with a thickness in places often meters of humus, lies waiting for us. We must create conditions for our people that favor its multiplication, and we must at the same time build a dike against the Russian flood. If this war had not taken place, the Reich would scarcely have increased its population during the next 10 years, but the Russian population would have grown vigorously. The earth continues to ground. The earth continues to go around. Whether it's the man who kills the tiger or the tiger who eats the man, The stronger asserts his will. It's the law of nature. The world doesn't change. Its laws are eternal. There are some who say the world is evil and that they wish to depart from this life. For my part, I like the world. Unless the desire to die is due to a lover's quarrel, I advise the desperate man to have patience for a year. The consolations will come. But if a human being has any other reason to wish to die than this, then let him die. I'm not stopping him. I merely call attention to the fact that one cannot escape this world entirely. The elements of which our body is made belong to the cycle of nature. As for the soul, it's possible that it might return to limbo until it gets an opportunity to reincarnate itself. But it would vex me if everybody wanted to have done with life. So this is very much his view is it's the law of the jungle. Like he says, what gives us a right to do this is that we can do it. And that's why when they can't do it, it turns out they don't have a right to do it. All right. What else we got? We knew during the First World War a type of Russian combatant who was more good-natured than cruel. Nowadays, this type no longer exists. Bolshevism has completely wiped it out. So there's the break between the Russians before Bolshevism, and then that type is wiped out by the Bolshevik Revolution. All right, what else we got? Okay. Hold up. Oh, yeah, and it is interesting though. He will remark on things that like these people contribute nothing to civilization, so that's intolerable. And even though it is very much biological and materialistic, his view, and might makes right, in most cases he does have there is strains of idealism and a higher idea. He says the Russians were entitled to attack their priests, but they had no right to assail the idea of a supreme force. It's the fact that we're feeble creatures and that a creative force exists. To seek to deny it is folly. In that case, it's better to believe something false than not to believe anything at all. Who's that little Bolshevik professor who claims to triumph over creation? People like that will break them. Whether we rely on the catechism or on philosophy, we have responsibilities in reserve, while they, their purely materialistic conceptions, can only devour one another. This is something he says about Russians. Mind you, this is still in 1941, and this is at a time where the Germans were just taking huge, they're taking Russian POWs like, by the hundreds of thousands and even into the millions, and they're just penning these guys off in the middle of nowhere and just letting them starve to death and cannibalize each other. They just put fences around them and huge crowds of Russians, and then just give them no food and just starve them to death, and that's it. And then this will change a little bit when they decide to use Russian POWs as forced labor, but they weren't. It wasn't that wholesome chungus or whatever. Okay, so what else we got? Hitler says, Bolshevism sets about its task in the same way as Christianity, so that the faithful may not know what is happening in the rest of the world. The object is to persuade them that the system they enjoy is unique in the world. in point of technical and social organization. Somebody told me of a lift man in Moscow who sincerely believed that there were no elevators anywhere else. I never saw anybody so amazed as that Russian ambassador, the engineer, who came to me one evening to thank me for not having put any obstacles in the way of a visit he paid to some German factories. At first I asked myself if the man was mad. I supposed it was the first time he saw things as they are, and I imagine he sent his government an indiscreet note on the subject. He was recalled to Moscow a few days later, and we learned he'd been shot. Okay. So, it's very funny that he learned of a lift man who's in Moscow who sincerely believed that there were no elevators anywhere else. What else we got? I tell you what. So, Hitler says, the Russian as an individual fighting man has always been our inferior. Russians exist only en masse, and that explains their brutality. I've always rebelled against the idea that Europe had reached the end of its mission, and that the hour of Russia or the United States had come. So, we see there's a lot of that Spenglerian maybe kind of idea that Europe is over and then Russia or the United States has come. He says he's against this idea, but then he does kind of apparently give into it at the end of the war. Or at least he's just pontificating or speculating if you're to agree with if you're to believe Albert Speer, which otherwise in a lot of ways you shouldn't, but I still find that so it just seems kind of believable. It seems the voice of Hitler. Okay. What else do we got? As allies, I prefer the Turks to the Bulgarians. That's why I'm ready to conclude a trade treaty with Turkey in which we'd supply... Okay. In Bulgaria, on the other hand, everything is uncertain. Thus I was struck to learn that after the conclusion of the tripartite pact, the president of the Bulgarian council was scarcely acclaimed by the population of Sofia despite the major importance of this pact to Bulgaria. And I was not less struck to know that at the same time, the population of Sofia was enthusiastically welcoming a Russian football team. The fact is that Bulgaria is strongly affected by Pan-Slavism, both on the political and on the sentimental level. She's attracted by Russia, even if Sovietized. I recognize that the King of Bulgaria is a very intelligent, even cunning man, but he doesn't seem to be capable of guaranteeing the stability of his regime. He himself confessed that he couldn't change a single minister or relieve a general of his command without endangering his crown. He has to act very cautiously, he says, beginning with granting sick leaves and then retaining these men's attachment with the help of numerous favors. To sum up as regards Bulgaria and Turkey, all right, blah, 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 blah. Oh, here we go. This is interesting. Talking about there's an assassination attempt on von Papen in Turkey, and Hitler says this attempted assassination is revealing as it concerns the mentality of the Russian organizers. With other peoples, supposing such an attempt was judged necessary for political reasons, an attempt would be made to save the man who was given the job of carrying it out. The Russians, on the other hand, for all their cleverness, arranged the action in such a way that it should cost the performer his skin. The setting was well designed. The poor wretch had an apparatus that enabled him, once the murder was committed, to produce an artificial fog, thanks to which he could try to escape. But what he had not been told was that as soon as he set the machine working, he would himself detonate the explosive charge that was destined to pulverize him. The only traces of him discovered were one of his shoes and his revolver. The assassin's accomplices were so disgusted by their master's villainy that they decided to reveal all they knew of the plot. So the Russians said that this was going to be like a smoke bomb to help this Russian assassin escape, but instead it just blows him up to get rid of him. He talks about this story a few times in the table talk, but it's somewhat amusing. Okay. What else we got? Oh, okay. We were talking about some polls a little bit. And mind you, polls. Okay, where to start? Okay, let's avoid attempting the Germanization of our vital space on too great a scale. Let's be cautious, especially with the Czechs and the Poles. According to Himmler, history proves that the Poles have their nationality tattooed on their bodies. They must therefore be kept under control by giving them the strongest possible stiffening of German officers and NCOs, and by trying to have them outnumbered by the German elements. It was agreed with Frank, the Governor General of occupied Poland, that the Krakow district, with its purely Germanic capital, and also the Lublin district, should be peopled by Germans. Once these two weak spots have been strengthened, it should be possible to drive the Poles slowly back. I don't believe it's necessary to proceed with much circumspection in this field, for we would be condemning ourselves to renew an experience we already had after the divisions of Poland. The soul of Poland remained lively because, on the one hand, the Poles hadn't to take the Russian domination seriously, and on the other hand, they'd succeeded in putting themselves politically in a strong position with the Germans, being helped in this by their allegiance to a Catholicism deeply tinged with politics. One can even say that the Poles played a decisive role in German home policy. It's very important for the future that Germans... Okay, here we go. It's very important for the future that the Germans don't mingle with the Poles, so that the new Germanic blood may not be transmitted to the Polish ruling class. Okay, so this is already after they pretty much wiped out the Polish ruling class. Himmler is right when he says that the Polish generals who genuinely put up a serious resistance in 1939 were, so to speak, exclusively of German descent. It's an accepted fact that it's precisely the best elements of our race who, as they lose awareness of their origin, add themselves to the ruling class of the country that has welcomed them. As for the elements of less value, they retain the characteristics of their ethnic group and remain faithful to their Germanic origin. The same caution is necessary toward the Czechs. They're skilled at not awakening the distrust of their occupiers and are wonderful at playing the role of subjects. It's true they've 5 centuries' experience of it. I saw them at work in Vienna during my youth, arriving penniless and dragging their worn-out shoes over the streets of the city. They quickly acquired the Viennese accent, and one fine day one was quite surprised to see them installed in key positions. Okay. So, what I thought was interesting was they insist that in 1939, the Polish generals who are fighting the hardest against Germany were exclusively of German descent. So they must be Germans. because they're fighting the German army hard. I find that kind of dubious, but there might be something, there might be something to it, but either way, that's just what he said. That's how he views it, and it's interesting that they did ruthlessly purge like Polish officers and things like that, even though they figured that these guys were Germans, so they weren't going to bother with any Germanization or whatever in the event. Okay. So moving on. So we're in 1942, September 1942. We're going to jump out and then it will be the duty of our commissars alone to supervise and direct the economy of the captured territories. And what I have just said applies equally to every form of organization. Above all, we don't want a horde of schoolmasters to descend suddenly on these territories and force education on the throats of subject races. To teach the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Kyrgyz to read and write will eventually be to our own disadvantage. Education will give the more intelligent among them an opportunity to study history, to acquire an historical sense, and hence to develop political ideas which cannot but be harmful to our interest. A loudspeaker should be installed in every village to provide them with odd items of news and, above all, to afford distraction. What possible use to them would a knowledge of politics or economics be? There is also no point in broadcasting any stories of their past history. All the villagers require is music, and plenty of it. Cheerful music is a great incentive to hard work, to give them plenty of opportunities to dance, and the villagers will be grateful to us. The soundness of these views is proved by our experience at home during the time of the Weimar Republic. One thing which is essential to organize in the Russian territories is an efficient system of communications. All right, and so on and so on. So yeah, you see, he wants to give them music, doesn't want to teach them history. The most foolish mistake we could possibly make would be to allow the subject races to possess arms. History shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subject races to carry arms have prepared their own downfall by so doing. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that the supply of arms to the underdogs is a sine qua non for the overthrow of any sovereignty. So let's not have any native militia or native police. German troops alone will bear the sole responsibility for the maintenance of law and order throughout the occupied Russian territories, and a system of military strongpoints must be evolved to cover the entire occupied country. So he didn't have any great replacement ideas of that he would kill them off by conscripting them into the army and giving them heavy weapons or something, and that they would be used for cannon fodder to kill them off or something, which is what right-wingers speculate, in their conspiracy theories now. They'll try to kill you by giving you heavy weapons and so forth. This is different than the Hitler view, anyhow, where he says, do not draft these people or do not give them weapons, and we'll take care of that entirely ourselves. The Germans will do that. Okay, so we're moving on. This is kind of a conversation about he's having with a Gauleiter, I believe, which is Forster. Forster quoted the problems raised by numerous special cases. He quoted the case of Polish workmen who, so on and so on. So Forster quotes Gunther. It would appear, according to Foster, it would appear that Professor Gunther, a specialist in these matters, or in Forster's opinion, if any Pole desired to acquire German nationality, the decision should depend upon the general impression made by the candidate. Even in cases where it is not possible to trace exactly the antecedents of the individual, there are nevertheless certain ethnical characteristics which, taken in conjunction with character and standard of intelligence, gave sure guidance. So they're talking about who, of the Poles, who should we consider worthy to Germanize? We could teach them German and make them citizens of the Reich or so forth. And they're talking about who they would do it, you know. So he quotes Gunther, which is a racial, is a Nazi race scientist. He's referring to H.K. Gunther, I believe. Professor Gunther, a specialist in these matters, was quite right when he asserts, after a tour of 10-odd days through the province of Danzig, that 4/5 of the Poles living in the north of the province could be Germanized. And called upon to make decisions in such cases, one should not forget, added Forster, that real life is always stronger than theory, and that therefore one should Germanize wherever possible, bearing in mind past experience and relying on one's common sense. In the southern and southeastern parts of the province, it should be better to start by establishing garrisons with the object of resuscitating the population, and only later to examine the possibilities of Germanization. Okay. The thing that should be avoided in all these regions and throughout the intermediary period was the introduction of German priests. It would be far better to support the Polish clergy. Polish priests, with the pressure that could be put on them, would prove more malleable. One could count on their going each Saturday to the governor and asking what you, so on and so forth. Okay. So Hitler says, okay, at this point, Hitler spoke again. It is not possible to generalize on the extent to which the Slav races are susceptible to the Germanic imprint. In point of fact, Tsarist Russia, within the framework of her pan-Slav policy, propagated the qualification Slav and imposed it on a large diversity of people who had no connection with the Slavonic race. For example, to label the Bulgarians as Slavs is pure nonsense. Originally, they were Turkomans. The same applies to the Czechs. It is enough for a Czech to grow a mustache for anyone to see, from the way the thing droops, that his origin is Mongolian. Among the so-called Slavs of the South, the Dinars are predominant. Turning to the Croats, I must say I think it is highly desirable from the ethnical point of view that they should be Germanized. There are, however, political reasons which completely preclude any such measures. There is one cardinal principle. This question of Germanization of certain people must not be examined in the light of abstract ideas and theory. We must examine each particular case. The only problem is to make sure wherever the offspring of any race will mingle well with the German population and will improve it, or whether, on the contrary, as is the case when Jew blood is mixed with German blood, negative results will arise. Unless one is completely convinced that the foreigners whom one proposes to introduce into the German community will have a beneficial effect, well, I think it's better to abstain, however strong the sentimental reasons may be which urge such a course on us. There are plenty of Jews with blue eyes and blonde hair, and not a few of them have the appearance which strikingly supports the idea of the Germanization of their kind. It has, however, been indisputably established that, in the case of Jews, if the physical characteristics of the race are sometimes absent for a generation or two, they will inevitably reappear in the next generation. Okay, so talking about Germanization. So he says that Czechs are Mongolian, the Croatians can be easily, he says it'd be desirous to Germanize Croatians, but he says that Mongolians, or that Czechs are Mongolian. But I don't know if that goes for all Czechs, but I don't know. That's just what he says. So we just go by his words. Okay. So the Soviets could have become a mortal danger to us if they had succeeded in undermining the military spirit of our soldiers with the slogan of the German Communist Party, "No more war," for at the same time as they were trying, disregarding the namby-pamby utterances about humanitarianism, which, we'll just go on. What does he say? The more we see of conditions in Russia, the more thankful we have. So he's talking about the Stakhanov system in Russia, which is sort of by like a Russian miner, where they're producing more and more, how to produce more, even more than what's required. But this, in turn, turned into like a system of raising quotas for Soviet workers. Okay. So he says, in another 10 years, there would have sprung up in Russia a mass of industrial centers inaccessible to attack, which would have produced armaments on an inexhaustible scale, while the rest of Europe would have degenerated into a defenseless plaything of Soviet policy. It's very stupid to sneer. This is Hitler talking. It's very stupid to sneer at the Stakhanov system. The arms and equipment of the Russian armies are the best proof of its efficiency and the handling of industrial manpower. Stalin, too, must command our unconditional respect. In his own way, he is a hell of a fellow. He knows his models, Genghis Khan and the others, very well. In the scope of his industrial planning is exceeded only by our own 4-year plan. And there is no doubt that he is quite determined that there should be in Russia no unemployment such as one finds in such capitalist states as the United States of America. So then Martin Bormann jumps in the conversation. This is Bormann, who's just returned from a tour of inspection of the kolkhoz in the vicinity of the general headquarters. So they're in Ukraine. Hitler has a headquarters in Ukraine. So Bormann's just gone and checked out a collective farm in the Ukraine. Bormann says, when one looks at the children, it is difficult to realize that sooner or later they too will acquire the flat Slav faces of their parents. Like the inhabitants of the Baltic states, they are fair, with blue eyes, bonny and chubby-faced. In comparison, our children look like tottering little chicks. It really is curious to think that these children will become Ukrainian adults, with their vulgar, inexpressive faces. I was much struck by the fact that in these huge open spaces one saw so many children and so few men. Such prolific breeding may one day give us a knotty problem to solve, for as a race they are much hardier by nature than we are. So Bormann says, as a race they are much hardier by nature than we are. The men have admirable teeth, and rarely does one see a man wearing glasses. They are well fed and bursting with good health at all ages. The difficult conditions under which these men have lived for centuries have brought into being a merciless process of selection. If one of us drinks a drop of their water, he all but dies. They, on the other hand, live in the dirt, drink the muddy, stagnant water of their ponds, and thrive on it. We fill ourselves with quinine as a safeguard against malaria, while the Ukrainians are so immune not only to malaria but to scarlet fever as well, that they can live with impunity in surroundings teeming with fleas and ticks. If these people are allowed under German supervision, that is, under greatly improved conditions, to multiply too quickly, it will be against our interests, for the racial pressures which these damned Ukrainians will exercise will constitute a real danger. Our interests demand just the reverse, namely that these territories, hitherto Russian, should in time be populated by a larger number of German colonists than the local inhabitants. So you see what he's saying there. He's saying that they have a certain racial health and they breed in certain ways that it could be bad for them if their population explodes when the Germans take over and improve the conditions. That's what Bormann says. Hitler replies, I recently read an article from the pen of some Herr Doctor advocating the prohibition of the sale in the occupied territories of contraceptives. If any criminal lunatic should really try to introduce this measure, I'd soon have his head off. In view of the extraordinary fertility of the local inhabitants, we should be only too pleased to encourage the women and the girls to practice the arts of contraception at all times. Far from prohibiting the sale of contraceptives, therefore, we should do our utmost to encourage it. We should call on the Jews for help. With their unrivaled sense of commerce, they're the very people for the job. In all seriousness, however, there is a very real danger that these local inhabitants will increase too rapidly under our care and domination. Their conditions of life will inevitably improve under our jurisdiction, and we must take the measures necessary to ensure the non-German population does not increase at an excessive rate. In these circumstances, it would be sheer folly to place at their disposal a health service such as we know in Germany, and so no inoculations and other preventative measures for the natives. We must even try to stifle any desire for such things by persuading them that vaccination and the like are really most dangerous. So he wants to encourage anti-vax for Ukrainians. It is furthermore essential to avoid doing anything which might give rise to a feeling of superiority or racial pride amongst the natives. This is the utmost importance, for it is only by the creation of the very reverse state of mind that we shall be able to prepare the ground for the accomplishment of our plans. For these reasons, the local population must be given no facilities for higher education. A failure on our part in this respect would simply plant the seeds of future opposition to our rule. Schools, of course, they must have, and they must pay for their tuition, but there is no need to teach them much more than, say, the meaning of the various road signs. Instruction in geography can be restricted to one single sentence. The capital of the Reich is Berlin, a city which everyone should try to visit once in his lifetime. Finally, elementary instruction in reading and writing in German will complete the course. Mathematics and such like are quite necessary. In setting up the educational system, the same principles apply to both Eastern territories and other colonies. We do not want any of this Enlightenment nonsense propagated by an advanced guard of parsons. What is the use of talking about progress to people like that? Jodl is quite right when he says that notices in the Ukrainian language, beware of the trains, are superfluous. What on earth does it matter if one or two more locals get run over by the trains? I am in favor of teaching a little German in the schools simply because this will facilitate our administration. Otherwise, every time some German instruction is disobeyed, the local inhabitant will come along with the excuse that he didn't understand. For the same reason, the Russian script must be replaced by the Latin. The greatest possible mistake we could make would be to take the local population too much under the wing of the state and to avoid all danger of our own people becoming too soft-hearted, too humane towards them. We must keep German colonies strictly separated from the local inhabitants. Germans will in no circumstance live in a Ukrainian town. If essential, it will be better to put Germans in a barracks outside a town than to allow them to live inside it. Otherwise, sooner or later, the process of cleaning up and improving the town will inevitably start. And Russian and Ukrainian towns are not in any circumstance to be improved or made more habitable. It is not our mission to lead the local inhabitants to a higher standard of life and our ultimate object must be to build towns and villages exclusively for Germans and absolutely separate from Russian or Ukrainian towns. The houses to be constructed for the Germans must in no respect resemble those of the Russians, and lime-plastered thatched roofs will not be used. Okay. So it's very, very interesting. This gives a glimpse of what was envisioned for the colonial rule that the Germans had planned for, and then the Soviet Union, how they viewed Ukrainians and things. And he's saying that, we don't want we can't teach these people racial pride. We have to rule over them. It's very interesting. Not that we need to go by what Hitler says or something, but it's just his observations are interesting. They make things they're interesting to consider in the light of our present day and recent events, and so the war we have now and things like that. All right, what else do we have? All right, there's a lot in here. There's only so much that we can cover, but I think a nuanced but consistent picture emerges, and it's certainly not like they're fighting for the freedom of all peoples or something, of all races, or like the Identity Europa view or something. Like they're just liberating all the people from the Jews or something. They're just liberating from, he actually says, in numerous times that what the work of the Jews is beneficial to what the Germans plan. So, I mean, say what you will, it's just you can cry about this, and however many people I hear this all the time about what they think about what Hitler thought, but I don't know, unless you could prove that he never said anything like this, but he definitely seemed to have said stuff like this. All right. It is not by here. What is it? The Foundations of St. Petersburg by Peter the Great was a fatal event in the history of Europe, and St. Petersburg must therefore disappear utterly from the earth's surface. Moscow too. Then the Russians will retire into Siberia. It is not by taking over the miserable Russian hovels that we shall establish ourselves as masters of the East. The German colonies must be organized on an altogether higher plane. We have never before driven forward into empty spaces. The German peoples have absorbed both northern and southern Austria, and the original inhabitants are still there, but they were Sorbwens, members of basic European stock, with nothing in common with the Slavs. As for the ridiculous 100 million Slavs, we will mold the best of them to the shape that suits us, and we will isolate the rest of them in their own pigsties, as anyone who talks about cherishing the local inhabitant and civilizing him goes straight off into a concentration camp. At harvest time, we will set up markets at the center, at all the centers of any importance. There we will buy up all the cereals and fruit and sell the more trashy products of our own manufacture. In this way, we shall receive for these goods of ours a return considerably greater than their intrinsic value. The profit will be pocketed by the Reich to defray the price of the campaign. Our agricultural machinery factories, our transport companies, our manufacturers, our household goods, and so forth will find there an enormous market for their goods. It will also be a splendid market for cheap cotton goods. The more brightly colored, the better. Why should we thwart the longing of these people for bright colors? My one fear is that the Ministry for Eastern Territories will try to civilize the Ukrainian women. These girls, bursting with health, would introduce a welcome strain into the race, for many of them are obviously of sound Germanic origin, otherwise whence the fair, blue-eyed children. The best among them we will gradually assimilate and take them into the Reich. The rest can remain here. So it's somewhat of a contradiction because he's saying not to, to keep separate and so forth, and if you have a heart for these people, you're going to the concentration camp. But he is saying that he wants to, by this time, and they're in the Ukraine, and he uses the same phrase as Bormann, bursting with health, these people, But he says they'd be a welcome strain in the race. So, but he also says they must be, they obviously are they're German, obviously. It's very, very interesting. But so the more things go on, he seems also maybe a little more pro-Slav. We get into 1943. Hitler says, he's talking about music. The whole really creative music is composed partly of inspiration and partly of a sense of composition. The inspiration is of Slavonic origin. The art of composition is of Germanic. It is when these two mingle in one man that the master of genius appears. In Bach's music, it is the composition which is marvelous, and he certainly had no drop of Slav blood in his veins. As regards Beethoven, on the other hand, one glance at his head shows that he comes of a different race. It is not pure chance that the British have never produced a composer of genius. It is because they are a pure Germanic race. So, British can't produce good music because they're purely Germanic. But you need to, for a man of genius, you need to mingle the Germanic and Slav blood. That's an interesting idea. This is what Hitler says. Okay, so what else? What else we got? I tell you what. There's a few other things we could go over. Let me look one up. I think we'll talk about maybe Joseph Stalin. I don't know. Let's see, say there are here a million tons of wheat in reserve from last year's harvest. Just think of what it will be like when we get things properly organized and the oil wells are in our possession. This Ukraine produces 13 or 14 million tons a year. Even if we show ourselves to be half as successful as organizers as the Russians, there's a cool 6 million for us. Next year, after the next harvest, we must organize thoroughly and work at full speed. Okay, so far. Stalin is half beast, half giant. To the social side, what else we got? I don't know about that one. Stalin pretends to have been the herald of the Bolshevik Revolution. In actual fact, he identifies himself with the Russia of the Tsars, and he merely resurrected the idea of pan-Slavism. For him, Bolshevism is only a means, a disguise designed to trick the Germanic and Latin peoples. If we hadn't seized power in 1933, the wave of Huns would have broken over our heads. All Europe would have been affected, for Germany would have been powerless to stop it. Nobody suspected it, but we were on the verge of catastrophe. To what an extent people failed to suspect it, I have some evidence. A few days before our entry into Russia, I told Goering that we were facing the severest test in our existence. Goering fell off his perch. Okay. The Russians never invent anything. All they have, they've got from others. Everything comes to them from abroad. The engineers, the machine tools, give them the most highly perfected bombing sites. They're capable of copying them, but not of inventing them. With them, working technique is simplified to the uttermost. Their rudimentary labor force compels them to split up the work into a series of gestures that are easy to perform, and of course, require no effort of thought. They eat up an incredible number of tractors, for they're incapable of performing the slightest repair. Even the Czechs, who are the most efficient of the Slavs, have no gift for invention, and yet they're hardworking and careful. When Skoda was started, it was by Austrians and Germans. Destroy their factories and the Russians can't rebuild them and set them working again. They can barely manage to set a factory working that works all by itself. Although they've always bought licenses for the most modern aircraft, their Rada is a flop. Their most recent model is still far from catching up with our 107. The Japanese are capable of improving something that exists already by borrowing from left and right whatever makes it go better. At the time of the pact, the Russians displayed a wish to possess a specification for our ships, so on and so forth. What was painful to me was to endure the visit of the Russian commercial delegation. The Russians probably learned the secret of the rockets by some piece of treachery committed before we took power. In fact, they've remained at the stage of technique of the period and haven't profited by the progress we've made since. Nevertheless, they've adopted a guiding rail, which perhaps they've got from the French. On our side, nobody in the army knew we had the rocket. The Russians attached importance to the... Okay, so... What else we got? Here we go. It occurred to me, when I tasted the soup of the people of Schleswig-Holstein, it occurred to me that the gruel of the Spartans cannot have been very different. In the times of the great migrations, the tribes were the product of ceaseless mixtures. The men who arrived from this, blah, blah. The Croatians are certainly more Germanic than Slav. The Estonians, too, have a lot of Germanic blood. The Estonians are the elite of the Baltic peoples. Then come the Lithuanians, and lastly the Latvians. Stalin used Latvians for executions, which the Russians found disgusting. They're the same people who used to have the job of executioners in the old empire of the Tsars. Okay. What else we got? There's more to talk about. There's more to be said, but that should give a pretty good idea, a pretty well-rounded view. So it's a little bit different, and as from what a lot of people say, I'll say that if you just go by his speeches or whatever, but his speeches say much the same thing. I'll say that, I guess. I guess here's a book from the speeches where he's talking about Russia. What do we got? Hold on. This process is practically complete in Russia. The whole of today's Russia is nothing more than a ruined culture and a mature colony to be cultivated by foreign capital, which must nevertheless draw in Aryan minds as practical laborers, for the Jew is not fit for this either. Here too he is only rapacious and gluttonous. He knows no orderly economy and no orderly body of people. He steals everything over there in Russia. They take the diamonds away from the noblemen to help the people, but then the diamonds disappear into foreign companies, never to be seen again. He seizes the wealth of the church, but not to feed the people. No, so on and so forth. But basically, he doesn't put a whole lot of importance to the fact that the Soviet Union is even communist or Marxist, because he says it's all just a trick, and the politics of it are just a trick. So he could admire Stalin. He even speaks of making Stalin, if he could, he'd make him as administrator of the region. They call the Gauleiter who takes over the Ukraine like a Stalin II, and things like that. And he gets into it. I could dig for this, but he talks about how Stalin used Jews to wipe out Ukrainian intelligentsia, and then he says he shipped these Jews to Siberia. So he's not really saying that, as people say, that it's like a wholly Jewish thing, although he sometimes seems to think that as well. But he could see it a few different ways. But there are times, but it's mostly pretty consistent. But he views Stalin, and he views like the idea of wiping out the intelligentsia of the region and taking it over and enslaving the people. It's something he would like to do for himself. I don't know. I guess you won't go too far into it. We've been talking for a while. We've been reading a bunch of stuff. This is comments right from Hitler. Say what you will about that. These are just quotes that are available. There's more to be had too. There's Hitler's second book, which is going to be more of the same, I think. Anyway, I think that's pretty interesting. You might have your own ideas of that, but hopefully that can clear up some, that could be just different than what people just asserting that maybe Hitler was a anti-colonial kind of figure. He's a victim of colonialism who's only helping other people who've been who are fighting communism or fighting Jewry or something, and he's just fighting or Britain or something, the British Empire, and he's just fighting for equality and he's fighting for justice or something. And it's not necessarily how he saw things. Like he didn't, it is kind of relevant now and how people might see things, or how you might, the perspective you might take on conflicts and things. But hopefully some of this has been refreshing or different for you. But all right. But thank you for listening.